The Galactic Confederation's training academy on Kepler 442b had seen thousands of species attempt their rigorous qualification programs. Built into the crystalline mountains of the third moon, the facility stretched across 17 levels, each designed to push different aspects of physical and mental capability to their absolute limits. The architecture itself was a marvel of interspecies cooperation, corridors wide enough for the massive Gorvani, gravity wells adjusted for the delicate Etherians, and atmospheric controls that could shift between 47 different breathing mixtures within seconds.
Commander HFY stood at the observation deck of Training Ground 7, her 6 arms crossed in a pattern that her species used to denote deep contemplation. As a Nexari, she possessed the natural ability to perceive kinetic energy patterns and predict movement trajectories, skills that had made her one of the most feared and respected combat instructors in the known galaxy. Her chitinous exoskeleton gleamed under the artificial lighting, and her compound eyes tracked every minute detail of the training ground below. Today marked the arrival of the newest species to seek membership in the Confederation, humans, from the small blue planet called Earth. The initial reports had been underwhelming. These bipedal mammals possessed no natural armor, no enhanced sensory capabilities, no apparent evolutionary advantages that would make them suitable for the harsh realities of galactic civilization. Their homeworld was a gravity well that most species would consider moderately challenging. Their atmospheric composition was dangerously reactive, and their lifespan was laughably brief by cosmic standards. Yet something had caught the attention of the Confederation Council. Perhaps it was the way these humans had managed to split the atom before achieving sustainable fusion. Maybe it was their peculiar habit of strapping themselves to controlled explosions just to escape their own atmosphere. Or it could have been the disturbing psychological profiles that suggested these creatures actually became more dangerous when cornered or threatened. A human delegation had arrived 3 standard cycles ago, and the preliminary assessments had yielded conflicting results. Physically, they fell within the bottom percentile of most measurable categories. Their reaction times were adequate but not exceptional. Their strength-to-body mass ratio was respectable but hardly impressive. Their sensory apparatus was so limited that they couldn't even perceive the majority of the electromagnetic spectrum without artificial enhancement. But there were anomalies in the data that troubled HFY. During the standard psychological evaluation, the human subjects had demonstrated an unusual response to stress scenarios. Where most species showed predictable patterns of fight-or-flight responses, these humans exhibited something the evaluation AI had termed adaptive optimization under pressure. They seemed to perform better when conditions became more challenging, not worse. The female human designated as test subject Alpha 7, though she had insisted on being called Sarah Chen, stood in the center of Training Ground 7, apparently oblivious to the sophisticated sensor arrays that surrounded her. She was unremarkable by most galactic standards. Average height for her species at approximately 1.7 meters, standard bipedal configuration with the typical human distribution of muscle mass. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple configuration, and her clothing consisted of the standard-issue training uniform provided to all test subjects. What made Commander HFY pause was not what she could see, but what her enhanced perception was telling her about the human's energy signature. Most species radiated kinetic potential in predictable patterns, tense muscles ready to spring into action, weight shifts that telegraphed intended movements, micro-expressions that revealed psychological state. This human was different. She stood with what appeared to be complete relaxation. Yet every sensor reading suggested she was simultaneously prepared for immediate action in any direction. The training ground itself had been configured for what the Academy termed a progressive stress evaluation. It was a deceptively simple concept. The subject would be required to maintain their position within a designated area while facing increasingly challenging obstacles. The test measured not just physical capability, but adaptability, decision-making under pressure, and that most crucial quality for Confederation membership, the ability to succeed when success seemed impossible. The first phase would involve basic projectile avoidance. The room's defensive systems would launch a series of soft-impact training rounds from various angles and velocities. Most species either attempted to catch or deflect the projectiles, or moved out of the way using whatever mobility advantages their evolution had provided. The Gorvani typically relied on their armored hide to simply absorb impacts. The Quicksilver-fast Zephyrians used their incredible speed to avoid everything entirely. The Collidery employed their natural energy shields to deflect incoming threats. Humans, according to their physiological assessments, should have been forced to rely primarily on mobility
and perhaps crude deflection techniques. They lacked natural armor, possessed no energy manipulation capabilities, and their reflexes, while adequate, were far from the fastest in the galaxy. Zephay activated the training sequence with a thought command transmitted through her neural interface. The room's ambient lighting shifted to a harsh white that would eliminate shadows and make tracking projectiles more difficult for vision-based species. The first wave of training rounds began to fire from concealed positions throughout the chamber. Soft polymer spheres about the size of a human fist, traveling at velocities that would be uncomfortable but not dangerous upon impact. The human named Sarah Chen did not move. This was not unusual in itself. Many species attempted to weather the first phase through defensive posturing or by relying on natural advantages. What was unusual was the way she didn't move. Her feet remained planted in exactly the same position, but her upper body began to perform what could only be described as a precise ballet of avoidance. A projectile fired from her left, aimed at center mass. Rather than stepping aside, she shifted her torso backwards and sideways, allowing the round to pass harmlessly through the space she had occupied a microsecond before. Another round came from above and behind. Without moving her feet or even turning around, she ducked and swayed, the projectile missing her by the smallest possible margin. Zephay's compound eyes tracked the human's movements with increasing interest. Each motion was economical to the point of perfection. Never more energy expended than absolutely necessary. Never more displacement than required to avoid impact. It was as if she could predict exactly where each projectile would be and planned her movements to create the smallest possible window of safety. The first phase concluded with 12 successful avoidances and 0 impacts. Standard protocol called for a brief analysis period, but the human simply returned to her original stance and waited. Her breathing remained steady. Her energy signature showed no signs of elevated stress, and she had not moved her feet even 1 centimeter from their original position. Phase 2 introduced multiple simultaneous projectiles and began to incorporate energy-based attacks, harmless but disorienting light bursts designed to confuse visual tracking systems. The rate of fire increased and the angles became more complex, with projectiles ricocheting off walls and approaching from trajectories that should have been impossible to predict. The human's response was to reduce her movements even further. Where Phase 1 had required visible shifting and swaying, Phase 2 saw her develop an almost supernatural economy of motion. Her head would tilt just enough to allow a projectile to graze past her ear. Her shoulder would drop precisely the distance needed to create a gap for an incoming round. Her spine would curve in small, precise adjustments that looked more like breathing than deliberate evasion. But she never moved her feet. Commander Zephay found herself leaning forward against the observation deck's reinforced viewing panel. In her 3 centuries of training diverse species, she had never encountered anything quite like this. The human's performance was not just successful, it was approaching theoretical perfection. The computer models that predicted projectile paths and calculated optimal avoidance strategies were being matched by a biological entity, using nothing but natural reflexes and spatial awareness. Phase 3 introduced the element that broke most test subjects: adaptive targeting. The room's AI would analyze the subject's movement patterns and begin to predict their evasive maneuvers, adjusting projectile trajectories in real time to compensate. It was a fiendish test that required not just physical skill, but the ability to think several steps ahead of a computer system specifically designed to counter biological predictability. The human's response was to become unpredictable in ways that should have been impossible. Her movements began to incorporate what Zephay's sensors classified as deliberate inefficiency. Instead of taking the optimal path to avoid a projectile, she would sometimes move in ways that seemed to invite impact, only to twist at the last possible moment in a direction that the targeting AI had calculated to be impossible based on her previous patterns. She began to use micromovements, tiny shifts in weight distribution or muscle tension that were so small they barely registered on sensors, but which created cascade effects that would compound into significant positional changes by the time projectiles reached her position. Most remarkably, she started to use the projectiles themselves as part of her defensive strategy. A sphere aimed at her head would be allowed to pass so close to her cheek that it would create a small air current, which she would use to aid in avoiding the next projectile. She began to position herself so that incoming rounds would interfere with each other, creating brief gaps in the pattern that she could exploit. And through it all, her feet never moved. By the end of Phase 3, even the AI seemed confused by her performance. The standard protocol called for an 85% hit rate by this point in the evaluation, The human had maintained a 0% hit rate while adhering to a self-imposed constraint that made the challenge exponentially more difficult. Phase 4 was rarely reached and never successfully completed. It incorporated physical obstacles that would rise from the floor and descend from the ceiling, forcing subjects to navigate a constantly changing three-dimensional maze while continuing to avoid projectiles and energy attacks. The obstacles moved on irregular patterns specifically designed to prevent adaptation, and the available space was reduced to approximately 60% of the original area. The first obstacle emerged from the floor directly beneath the human's feet, a rising platform that would force movement or result in an automatic failure for leaving the designated testing area. For the first time since the evaluation began, it appeared that Sarah Chen would be forced to move. Instead, she stepped onto the rising platform. As it elevated her roughly 1 meter above the original floor level, she maintained perfect balance despite the platform's irregular motion pattern. When the next obstacle, a horizontally moving barrier, swept toward her position, she simply ducked underneath it while riding the platform. When projectiles began targeting her elevated position, she used the platform's movement as part of her evasive strategy, timing her motion to synchronize with the obstacle's path. When additional platforms began to rise and fall around her, creating a complex pattern of moving surfaces, she began to step from one to another with the casual grace of someone walking across stepping stones in a garden stream. Technically, her feet were moving, but they never touched the original floor again. She had found a way to satisfy the literal requirements of the test while adapting to challenges that should have made her strategy impossible. Commander HFY realized she was witnessing something unprecedented in the Academy's history. This human was not just succeeding at an impossible test, she was redefining what the test meant. Every assumption built into the evaluation protocol was being challenged by a creature that refused to accept that limitations were permanent rather than simply obstacles to overcome. Phase 5 had never been successfully completed by any species. The Academy's designers had included it more as a theoretical maximum than a realistic expectation. It combined all elements from previous phases while adding gravitational distortions that would randomly alter the effective pull and direction of attraction throughout the testing area. Species would find themselves suddenly subjected to forces pulling them towards walls or ceiling, while still needing to avoid projectiles whose trajectories were being constantly altered by the same gravitational anomalies. The human named Sarah Chen rode the first gravitational wave like a surfer riding an ocean current. As the floor's gravitational orientation shifted to pull her toward the eastern wall, she adjusted her stance and used the change in effective down to enhance her mobility between the moving platforms. When gravity suddenly reversed, pulling her toward the ceiling, she used the momentum to spring between obstacles that had suddenly become stepping stones in a vertical climb. The projectiles, now following curved and spiraling paths due to the gravitational distortions, became part of an intricate three-dimensional dance. She would time her movements to gravitational shifts so that as she fell or rose, projectiles would pass through spaces she had occupied moments before or would occupy after the gravitational field changed again. For the first time in the evaluation, she began to smile. Commander HFY's sensor readings indicated that the human's heart rate had actually decreased during the most challenging phase. Her brain activity showed patterns consistent with what her species called flow state, a psychological condition where challenge and skill balanced so perfectly that conscious effort seemed to disappear, leaving only instinctive perfection of performance. The evaluation concluded not because the human had failed, but because the testing system had reached its operational limits. Every failsafe had been activated, every variable had been pushed to maximum parameters, and still the human stood, or rather, moved gracefully through three-dimensional space without having suffered a single impact. As the systems powered down and the obstacles retracted into their storage positions, Sarah Chen descended to the original floor on the last remaining platform. She stepped off onto the exact spot where she had begun the test, folded her hands behind her back, and waited. The silence in the observation deck was profound. Commander HFY's 6 arms had unconsciously arranged themselves in the Nexari gesture of reverent amazement, a posture reserved for witnessing events that challenged one's understanding of what was possible. Part 2. The lesson unfolds. The debriefing chamber was a circular room designed to accommodate the wide variety of body configurations found among Confederation species. Adjustable seating could adapt to everything from the serpentine chythrans to the crystalline resonans, and the holographic display system could present information in formats comprehensible to dozens of different sensory modalities.
Sarah Chen sat in what appeared to be a standard chair, though the room's adaptive systems had already begun subtle modifications to optimize her comfort and attention. Across from her, Commander Zafhai occupied a specialized platform that supported her Nexari physiology while allowing full range of motion for her 6 arms. The evaluation results, Zafhai began, her translator converting her species' complex harmonic language into standard Confederation Common, are unprecedented in the Academy's 847-year history. According to our records, you achieved a perfect score while simultaneously imposing additional constraints that should have made success mathematically impossible. Sarah's response was characteristically human. A slight shrug accompanied by what the cultural database identified as a self-deprecating smile. I've had good teachers, and honestly, once you get used to moving in 3 dimensions, it's not that different from martial arts or dance. This statement revealed something that had puzzled Zefhei throughout her preliminary study of human culture. These creatures routinely engaged in activities that served no obvious survival purpose, yet somehow enhanced their capabilities in entirely different contexts. They would spend decades learning to move their bodies in precise patterns for what they called art, then apply those skills to combat situations. They would voluntarily subject themselves to extreme physical stress in competitive scenarios, developing mental resilience that carried over into crisis management. Your species practices combat techniques for recreation, Zephi observed. It was not quite a question. Some of us do. I started learning Aikido when I was 7 years old. My sensei, teacher, used to tell us that the goal wasn't to become stronger than our opponents, but to become someone who didn't need opponents to define strength. Sarah paused, then added, he also said that true victory meant winning without fighting, and perfect technique meant achieving your goal without wasted effort. The philosophical implications were staggering. Most species viewed combat as a contest of capabilities, stronger defeating weaker, faster outrunning slower, more resilient outlasting less enduring. The concept of victory through non-engagement, of success through minimal action, suggested a fundamentally different approach to challenges. Explain this concept of winning without fighting, Zefhai requested. Her academic fascination was overriding her instructor protocols, but the implications for Confederation strategic thinking could be profound. Sarah was quiet for a moment, her expression suggesting she was searching for words to explain something that her culture took for granted but which might seem alien to other species. If someone attacks you with anger, and you respond with anger, then you've accepted their choice of battlefield. You're fighting on their terms. But if you can remain calm and centered, you can choose how to respond in a way that solves the problem without escalating it. She gestured toward the now inactive training ground visible through the chamber's transparent walls. In there, the attack was projectiles trying to hit me. The obvious response would be to fight back, deflect them, destroy them, or run away. But the real challenge was to understand what the test was actually measuring. It wasn't about my ability to fight projectiles. It was about my ability to maintain my position while adapting to changing conditions. So you chose not to engage with the projectiles as opponents, Zephe said, beginning to understand. Exactly. I treated them as part of the environment, like weather or terrain. You don't fight a river. You work with its current. You don't battle a mountain. You find the path that works with its structure. The projectiles had their own patterns and purposes. My job was to find the spaces where we could coexist. This perspective represented a complete paradigm shift from standard Confederation military doctrine. Most species approach threats through hierarchical response protocols. Assess threat level, match with appropriate force magnitude, engage until threat is neutralized. The human approach suggested that threat assessment itself might be flawed, that redefining the nature of the encounter could make force unnecessary. Commander Zafhai accessed her neural interface to review the sensor data from the evaluation. The computer analysis revealed something she had missed during real-time observation. The human had not actually been avoiding the projectiles through prediction and reaction. Instead, she had been moving in patterns that created optimal probability flows. Her positioning influenced where projectiles would be fired, and her micro-movements affected their trajectories in ways that created safe spaces rather than requiring her to find them. You were controlling the test environment, Zefhai realized, not just responding to it. Sarah's smile broadened. My sensei used to say that advanced technique looks effortless because you're not fighting against reality. You're dancing with it. When you understand the principles that govern a system, you can influence outcomes without appearing to apply force.
The implications were staggering. If this was representative of human strategic thinking, then their military capabilities had been drastically underestimated. A species that could influence outcomes through subtle manipulation of system dynamics rather than direct application of force would be nearly impossible to predict or counter using conventional tactical analysis. "Tell me about the constraint you imposed," HFY requested. "Why did you choose not to move your feet during the first 3 phases?" "Honestly, at first it was just intellectual curiosity. I wanted to see if it was possible. But then I realized it was making me better at the actual challenge. When you can't rely on gross motor movement, you have to develop much finer control over your body mechanics. You start noticing things like how breathing affects your center of gravity, or how a tiny change in muscle tension can shift your balance in ways that add up over time." She paused, then continued with what seemed to be a moment of genuine insight. But there was something else. "The constraint forced me to really understand what the test was measuring. If I could pass while making it harder for myself, then I truly understood the principles involved. It wasn't about my physical capabilities. It was about my ability to work with the system instead of against it." This concept of voluntarily imposed limitations as a path to greater understanding was appearing throughout human culture in HFY's research files. They would voluntarily restrict their diet to develop discipline. They would choose to travel using only muscle power when mechanical alternatives existed. They would impose artificial rules on recreational activities specifically to make them more challenging. "Your species seeks difficulty," HFY observed. "We seek growth," Sarah corrected. "Difficulty is just one path to it. When things are too easy, you don't learn anything new about yourself or the world. But when you're pushed beyond your comfort zone, you discover capabilities you didn't know you had." The cultural database had flagged this concept repeatedly. Humans appeared to have an almost pathological drive toward improvement and optimization. Where most species sought homeostasis and stability, humans seemed to actively pursue situations that would force adaptation and development. "This explains your species' unusual technological progression," HFY mused. "Most civilizations develop tools to reduce difficulty and increase comfort. Your species develops tools that enable you to attempt greater challenges. We went to the moon not because it was easy, but because it was hard," Sarah quoted. "One of our leaders said that decades before we actually managed it. The difficulty was the point. It forced us to develop technologies and organizational capabilities that we used to improve life for everyone." Commander HFY was beginning to understand why the human delegation had caught the attention of the Confederation Council. This was not a species that would be content to occupy a minor role in galactic civilization. Their psychological makeup virtually guaranteed that they would continue pushing boundaries and seeking greater challenges until they either achieved remarkable success or destroyed themselves in the attempt. "The philosophical foundation you describe," HFY said carefully, "suggests capabilities that extend beyond individual performance. How does your species apply these principles to larger-scale challenges?" Sarah's expression grew more serious. "We've had a lot of practice with problems that seemed impossible to solve. Climate change, resource depletion, conflicts between different groups of humans. These are challenges where traditional approaches of applying more force or resources don't work. You have to find ways to change the fundamental dynamics of the system." She gestured toward the observation ports that showed the vast expanse of space surrounding the Academy station. "Coming out here? Joining the galactic community? That's the same kind of challenge. We can't succeed by trying to be like every other species. We have to find ways to contribute that use our actual strengths, rather than competing in areas where we're naturally disadvantaged." "And what do you see as humanity's strengths in a galactic context?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, clearly giving the question serious consideration. "Adaptability, I think. Most species seem to have found approaches that work for them, and then refined those approaches over time. That makes sense. Why change something that's successful? But humans have always had to adapt to different environments, different challenges, different ways of organizing society. We're used to figuring things out as we go." She paused, then added, "And we're good at seeing connections between things that don't seem related. The movement principles I learned in martial arts help me understand the testing scenario, but they also help with engineering problems, with understanding social dynamics, with artistic expression. We tend to assume that insights from one area can be applied to others." This cross-domain thinking was another pattern that had emerged in the cultural analysis. Humans routinely applied concepts from biology to engineering, from music to mathematics, from athletics to business strategy. Their tendency to see underlying patterns that connected disparate fields could be a significant advantage in the complex multi-species environment of galactic civilization. Commander HFY made a decision that would later be recognized as one of the pivotal moments in human-Confederation relations. "I am going to recommend that your species be accepted for full membership status," she announced. "However, I am also going to recommend that the standard integration protocols be modified for humanity's unique characteristics." Sarah raised an eyebrow, a human expression that the cultural database translated as intrigued surprise. Most new member species undergo a structured acclimatization program, designed to help them adapt to Confederation standards and practices, HFY explained. "For humanity, I believe this approach would be counterproductive. Instead, I will recommend that human representatives be integrated directly into complex multi-species challenge scenarios where your adaptive capabilities and non-linear thinking patterns can be fully utilized." "You're saying we should go straight to the deep end of the pool?" The metaphor was unfamiliar, but context made the meaning clear. "Yes. Your species appears to perform optimally when faced with challenges that require growth and adaptation. Standard acclimatization protocols would likely result in boredom and underperformance." Sarah grinned, an expression that the database labeled as indicating enthusiastic agreement. "That sounds perfect. When do we start?" Part 3, The Transformation 6. Standard months after Sarah Chen's unprecedented performance at the Academy, the Confederation Council convened in emergency session. The catalyst was not an external threat or diplomatic crisis, but rather a series of reports from field commanders describing what could only be termed the human effect in multi-species operational teams. The council chamber on Nexus Prime was a marvel of architectural compromise, designed to accommodate the radically different physical and sensory requirements of 43 member species. The massive spherical space could be configured with varying gravity fields, atmospheric compositions, and lighting spectra, all carefully balanced to ensure no species gained unfair advantage in debates while maintaining basic survival requirements for all attendees. Ambassador Keth Moran of the Gorvani held the rotating council leadership position, his massive frame occupying a reinforced platform designed to support his species' considerable bulk. His voice, when translated through the universal communication matrix, carried the rumbling authority that had made the Gorvani natural leaders in the Confederation's early years. "We convene to address Integration Report 4471. Gamma, concerning the deployment of human personnel in active operational scenarios," he announced. The chamber's acoustic systems carried his words to every corner of the sphere, simultaneously translating them into the communication modalities appropriate for each species present. The first testimony came from Fleet Commander Ziff of the Zephyrian Defense Corps, whose quicksilver form flickered with agitation as she addressed the assembly. "3 weeks ago, my rapid response unit was assigned to investigate anomalous energy readings from the neutral zone. Standard protocol called for a reconnaissance mission with potential for hostile contact. The human assigned to my team requested permission to observe system dynamics before committing to any particular approach." The translation matrix conveyed not just words but emotional undertones, and the assembled delegates could sense this confusion at the memory. Rather than deploying our standard survey pattern, the human suggested we monitor the energy signatures for patterns that might indicate their source and purpose. What we discovered was that the anomalous readings were not evidence of hostile activity, but rather a previously unknown species attempting to establish communication protocols. A ripple of interest passed through the chamber. First contact scenarios were among the most delicate and dangerous situations the Confederation faced, requiring careful adherence to established diplomatic procedures. The approach was completely outside established procedure. Ambassador Keth Moran's query rumbled through the chamber. What was the outcome of this deviation from protocol? "Complete success," Scythe admitted, her form flickering more rapidly. The previously unknown species, now designated the Resonant Collective, has been welcomed as a provisional member of the Confederation. Their unique harmonic technologies have already contributed solutions to 3 previously intractable engineering problems. The human's approach resulted in first contact that took days instead of the standard years-long cautious approach, with superior outcomes by every measurable standard. Similar reports followed from across Confederation space. Human team members were consistently producing results that exceeded expectations, while using methods that defied standard operating procedures. More troubling from an institutional perspective, other species working alongside humans were beginning to adopt their unconventional approaches, leading to what some analysts were calling doctrine contamination.
Commander Zeth Val of the Caladary Engineering Corps provided perhaps the most dramatic example. Our deep space construction project in the Kepler sector was behind schedule and over budget. Standard engineering approaches were failing because of unexpected interactions between dark matter fluctuations and our conventional energy shield technologies. The human engineer assigned to our team, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, spent the first week simply observing our standard procedures without making suggestions or comments. The crystalline being's harmonic voice carried undertones of what other species recognized as professional confusion. At the end of that observation period, she requested permission to attempt what she called working with the dark matter instead of against it. Her proposal involved redesigning our entire approach to treat the dark matter fluctuations as a resource rather than an obstacle. The project was completed 3 weeks ahead of schedule and 17% under budget. More significantly, the techniques developed have applicability to dozens of other engineering challenges throughout Confederation space. The human approach transformed a failure scenario into a breakthrough, with implications that extend far beyond the original project. The pattern was consistent across dozens of reports. Humans would observe existing systems and procedures, then propose approaches that treated apparent obstacles as potential resources. They displayed an uncanny ability to identify inefficiencies and alternative pathways that had been invisible to species with centuries more experience. Perhaps most remarkably, they seemed to excel in crisis situations where standard approaches had failed. When presented with problems that had no precedent or established solution paths, humans would develop novel approaches by combining insights from seemingly unrelated domains. Admiral Korthak of the Nexari Strategic Command presented the most significant case study. A Rimwood incursion presented a tactical scenario for which no standard Confederation response existed. An unknown hostile force was employing weapons technologies that rendered our conventional shields ineffective, while using movement patterns that made traditional targeting impossible. The six-armed commander's posture conveyed the deep respect that combat veterans reserved for truly exceptional performance. Human tactical analyst Lisa Rodriguez requested access to all available data about the hostile forces, including information that was considered irrelevant by our standard analysis protocols. She spent 48 hours studying not just their military capabilities, but their apparent social organization, resource acquisition patterns, and what she called decision-making psychology. Her tactical recommendation was to avoid direct confrontation entirely. Instead, she proposed demonstrating our capabilities in a way that would make continued aggression disadvantageous from their perspective, while simultaneously offering them an alternative that would satisfy their apparent objectives without requiring conflict with Confederation forces. The chamber fell silent as Admiral Korthak continued. The engagement lasted 6 hours instead of the projected 6 months. The hostile force not only withdrew but requested formal diplomatic contact. They are now provisional trading partners. The humans' approach achieved complete tactical success while avoiding casualties on either side and creating new opportunities for the Confederation. Ambassador Keth Moran's rumbling voice carried a note of concern that resonated through the chamber. These reports suggest that human integration is proceeding more rapidly and with greater impact than our projections anticipated. What are the implications for Confederation standard operating procedures? The question sparked intense debate among the assembled delegates. Some species argued that human approaches should be systematically studied and incorporated into official doctrine. Others expressed concern that abandoning time-tested procedures in favor of experimental methods could lead to catastrophic failures. The debate continued for hours, touching on fundamental questions about the nature of progress, the value of institutional knowledge, and the risks inherent in rapid change. It was ultimately Dr. Yenaplar of the Etherian Research Council who provided the insight that would shape the Confederation's response. "We are approaching this question incorrectly," she announced, her gaseous form shimmering with the patterns that indicated deep thoughtfulness among her species. "We are debating whether human approaches are superior to established methods, but that frames the issue as a competition between different ways of solving the same problems." Her communication tendrils extended toward the chamber's central display, which began showing comparative analyses of human and traditional approaches to the same challenges. Examination of the data suggests something different. Human methods are not simply alternative solutions to known problems. They are approaches to identifying and solving problems that our existing frameworks do not recognize as existing. The implications of this observation rippled through the chamber. If humans were not just providing better answers to existing questions but asking entirely different questions,
then the impact of their integration would be far more profound than anyone had anticipated. Consider the Kepler sector construction project. Dr.
Pla continued. The Kaladari Engineering Corps was focused on overcoming dark matter interference with energy shield technologies. The human engineer redefined the problem as how to utilize dark matter properties as part of the solution. These are fundamentally different approaches to understanding the challenge.
Similar patterns were evident in every case study. Humans consistently reframed problems in ways that revealed solution paths that had been invisible using traditional analytical frameworks.
They seemed to possess an intuitive understanding that the way a problem was defined determined which solutions could be discovered. This suggests, Dr. Pla concluded, that human integration will not simply improve Confederation capabilities in known areas, it will expand our understanding of what problems can be solved and what solutions are possible. The vote, when it finally came, was unprecedented in Confederation history. Rather than debating specific policy changes or procedural modifications, the Council voted to formally recognize what they termed adaptive problem-solving methodologies as a fundamental strategic resource for the Confederation. Human personnel would not be limited to standard career progression paths or conventional specialization tracks. Instead, they would be integrated into multi-species teams across all areas of Confederation activity, with explicit authorization to propose alternative approaches to any challenge or obstacle. More significantly, the Council established the Institute for Adaptive Methodologies, tasked with studying human problem-solving approaches and developing training programs that could help other species expand their own analytical capabilities. Ambassador Kethmoran's closing statement captured what many would later recognize as a pivotal moment in galactic history. We welcome humanity not simply as another member species, but as teachers who will help the entire Confederation discover capabilities we did not know we possessed. The transformation was not limited to formal institutional changes. Throughout Confederation space, individuals and organizations began experimenting with what became known as human-style thinking. The key insight that spread fastest was the recognition that constraints and obstacles could often be transformed into resources and advantages through careful reframing of challenges. Sarah Chen, now serving as Director of Human Integration Protocols, established training centers on 17 different worlds. The curriculum focused not on teaching specific techniques, but on developing the mental flexibility to see familiar situations from radically different perspectives. The goal, she explained in her address to the first interspecies class at the Academy, is not to think like humans, but to think like yourselves with expanded possibilities. Every species has unique capabilities and perspectives. The human contribution is not our specific solutions, but our approach to discovering what solutions are possible. The class itself demonstrated the principle. Rather than segregating species by capability or teaching universal techniques, the program paired different species to tackle challenges that required combining their unique strengths in novel ways. Gorvani durability combined with Etherian analytical precision. Zephyrian speed integrated with Kalidari energy manipulation. Nixari predictive capabilities enhanced by human adaptive frameworks. The results exceeded every projection. Teams that had been trained in adaptive methodologies consistently outperformed conventional groups by margins that could not be explained by individual capability improvements alone. The synergistic effects of combining different species' strengths through human-inspired frameworks created capabilities that no single species could achieve independently. Within 2 years of human integration, the Confederation had resolved several long-standing diplomatic conflicts, completed infrastructure projects that had been stalled for decades, and developed new technologies that opened entirely new areas of scientific inquiry. The man who had once stood motionless in Training Ground 7, refusing to move her feet while dancing between impossible trajectories, had become the catalyst for a transformation that would reshape galactic civilization. But perhaps more importantly, she had demonstrated that the greatest victories come not from destroying opposition, but from transforming the nature of the challenge itself. The lesson that echoed through council chambers and training facilities across the galaxy was elegantly simple. The individual who masters their own limitations becomes unlimited in their potential to transform not just themselves, but the entire context in which they operate. As Sarah Chen had learned from her sensei decades earlier on a small blue planet, true strength comes not from the ability to overcome external obstacles, but from the wisdom to transform obstacles into opportunities. And in that transformation, both the individual and their entire world are forever changed. The final entry in the Academy's permanent records would note that test subject Alpha HFY-7 had indeed succeeded without moving her feet. But more significantly, she had moved everything else.